It's great to see everybody again. My name is Bob Hawkins. I'm our global lead for technology and innovation and education at the World Bank. We have kind of pulled this group together as a way to facilitate dialogue around kind of emerging technology issues, one of which is blockchain, for which we are getting an increased amount of demand and questions from our client countries and ministries of education around the world. We're partnering with the Learning Economy Foundation on this series. This is the fifth of six in the series. We started in February, which is kind of a primer overview of blockchain technologies and the relevance to education. We came back in April to talk about the possibilities to create ecosystems and education networks around the use of the technology. And then we drilled down a bit in June on learner-centered credentials, looking at kind of what is the experience around empowering users with these credentials. What are some of the challenges and opportunities? What are some of the technologies with regard to digital wallets, self-sovereign ID, ownership of credentials? And then we came back together in September to look at kind of the broader issues of the skills economy and ways in which skills have currency in the skills economy and how we can think about that uniquely. We have two more sessions left. This one, which is doing a deep dive on assessment. And then we'll come back again in December for the final session of the year, which will look at crypto economics and looking at the economics of the exchange of value within education systems. So we want this to be very much a discussion. Please kind of use the chat to kind of introduce yourself, share any projects you're working on, your organization. Also, as you have questions, please include them in the chat as well, and we'll try to facilitate a dialogue as we discuss this issue over the next hour and a half or so. So with that, let me pass it over to Chris to give some introductory remarks. Chris?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you again for joining us. This has been such an interesting evolution through this, all of these different subjects related to, the future of education and employment. And, this is a really important one when we start to dig in and understand, like, how do we assess these skills? How do we think about this differently in the 21st century, right? Do the old models still fit? Are there evolutions to the old models? Can we supplement the old models with new models? And we have some great panelists today, and I know there are many others who have been invited who have some of their own projects, models, ecosystems, which are really getting at these challenges and creating new ways of doing it, and lots of great learnings. And so I'm very excited to dig in, and I appreciate everyone who has joined us again. I want to introduce a couple of folks who are coming up. The first, Robert Hawkins, who you just met, and Wesley Tedder from UNESCO will be kind of opening us up and sharing some of the basics of assessment in the 21st century, and helping us to kind of create a primer for what to think about next. And then we have a great panel from folks from LEGO Foundation, from Brookings Institute, and from ETS, Education Testing Systems, who are each doing unique approaches to how to think about assessment in this new generation. So I know we always are packed to the end, so I'll go ahead and move on to the primer, so we have plenty of time for everyone to speak. And again, thanks everyone for joining, and hopefully you'll join us again 2 months from today as we get into understanding incentive models for aligning all the different actors in education and employment into an ecosystem. So I turn it over to Robert and to Wesley. I'm not sure who takes over next, but to either of you who want to get in and start sharing.
Wes, over to you.
All right. Warm greetings, everyone. My name is Wesley Teeter, and I am just thrilled to be here. Thank you, Bob and Chris. Really, I'm looking forward to the panel, so I'm going to be very brief. I'll take about 5 minutes. And really, I think assessment is such a central topic. It really underpins everything we've done so far in the series, so I think we have a lot to unpack. I'll highlight just 4 brief points as part of our primer today. I'll share some materials in the chat. You'll see some things popping up here that I think are good reference points going forward, because I think we have plenty that we want to go through. The first, take a look at this. This is a slide from Joy Ito from the Media Lab at MIT. And I think this is not to focus specifically on learning assessments. It's just to show the complexity of knowledge systems and the idea that what we're talking about here today in terms of assessment, there's a lot of subjectivity involved. We're trying to understand objective reality, but it has a lot to do with your perspectives, your goals, and that's really the first point. Knowledge systems are complex. Assessment is an art as much as a science. What you value matters. So what we're listening here for today is, what we value, the context, how do we account for specific context matters, our goals for the assessments, local knowledge systems. I want to hope we touch on that for the discussions today. But across all of these areas, we have incomplete knowledge. We have a long way to go, and certainly a lot we want to cover in a brief time. I'm going to post one more element in the chat. This speaks to issues around out-of-school children. Again, access issues are critical for assessments. 15.8 million kids out of school. How do we deal with that? A lot here to unpack, and a lot of disconnects across our systems. I love this slide from the Learning Economy Foundation because it shows that assessment is just one piece of our educational experience and our work experience. And this slide for me speaks to what we're trying to do is to connect assessment and learning experiences so that we can get meaningful feedback as individuals for our own life and career. So how do we build those connections? And I think that's what we're looking for, not just a snapshot, but how do our different educational systems and employment systems and non-formal learning, how do we get that all to connect across countries? Very complex issue, but I think Learning Economy Foundation is pushing in a good direction, and the series of, this push towards open source, rich data descriptors, we need to be listening for that in the context of our discussion today and the role of assessment. So I'll give you two specific examples that have to, speak to equity issues, which for me are really important. The first is about employment, assessment for employment. It talks about a landscaper at a private school. This is from a friend of mine. The gentleman was really well trained. He had a bachelor's degree in horticulture, but the soil was cracking, the trees were dying, almost lost an entire landscaping project. And it turned out that the water wasn't turned on. So you have qualifications, you have assessment, everything looks correct, but what does that mean in the context of performance in employment? So assessment is imperfect, and I think that's an important point. Another is equitable access. I think this is another point of what we're talking about. Another example, Sub-Saharan Africa, a human rights professional applying for a master's program. How do we assess an individual that doesn't have a bachelor's degree, doesn't have qualifications? I think this is an important point that we need to be thinking about. And point number two, that our learning assessments are often disconnected from other educational, life, and work experiences. So how do we actually incorporate our learning and understanding across systems? President Michael Crow from ASU reminds us that we're not moving at the speed of climate change. Think about that. The idea that what we assess has gotten us into the troubles we're in with the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a long way to go before what we assess matters in the world around us to promote sustainable development. So that speaks to this point number three, which I think is still anchors back in the ethical considerations. The ethical considerations for assessment and measurement, including issues around fairness and transparency. I think it's just critical. Let me get back. And 1 second. I think we just lost that slide. 1 second. So some of the common definitions that you wanted to just briefly touch on, let me bring that back up. And this is what our shared logic is all about. Making sure that we have a common language is also something we're listening for here today. The idea that we can use common understanding of learning outcomes, of our understanding of assessment itself and prior learning. I point this out because UNESCO has specific conventions that provide us a common definition. We don't have to recreate the wheel in this sense. So we're trying to use existing conventions and existing understanding to make sure that our systems can communicate across structures. I think this is really important that we have this common definition and common understanding. One way we do that in assessments, of course, is as you've seen, the assessment frameworks are relevant for assessing content and skills. We're listening for broad frameworks that can be applicable across borders. The international assessments, PEARLS is one at the bottom there. How we understand international reading literacy. How do we make sure that learners are empowered with that testing data? International assessment allow us to move between countries and make comparable studies. We need to make sure that learners are at the center of that experience, that they can connect that education and experience throughout their lifespan. That leads us into performance-based financing. Once individuals are empowered, once systems and policymakers have good evidence, how do we use assessments to inform our decision-making? We have a very long way to go to promote quality education and the achievement of SDG 4. So there's a lot more we can do. There are examples out there. I could not find many that actually anchored blockchain. UNESCO has a good one here that I wanted to briefly promote. It's called Learning Coin. This one is actually giving cash payments, this earn to learn. There are examples out there. They're very small scale. So we're talking about how assessments can be used to promote learning. So through reading programs, providing scholarships for reading achievement. So I think this is really a specific example of what assessment can do to drive recognition of learning and understanding how assessments can support learners throughout their lifespan. But again, coming back to existing competency frameworks, we need to build on what we know. This is just one quick example. I'll share these examples in the chat as well, so that you have an understanding of how we measure across different areas of work. And Bob and I talked a little bit about this as well, this idea of libraries of skills, libraries of smart contracts. Qualification frameworks based on learning outcomes are a common language across countries. They're trying to make connections based on descriptions of learning outcomes, and again, promoting how assessment can lead to the promotion of flexible learning strategies across borders so that all learners can move through those systems. And that's really what we're doing at UNESCO, is trying to understand how these conventions and operational definitions can help us promote cross-border mobility, education and employment, and ensure equitable access to quality education. So promoting fairness and transparency is also something I think we'll be listening here today. So with that, I'll post a few more comments in the chat and look forward to our panel here today. Over to you, Bob.
Excellent. Let me jump in here and go ahead and share a screen. This is kind of a primer for our panel. And I'm just going to build off some of the ideas that Wes shared to kind of make the link to blockchain technology itself, and why are we thinking about this technology as a potential use case for assessment. Let me go ahead. So again, just giving the overall picture, again, the confidence in the quality of knowledge, skills, attitudes that students have is the cornerstone of a value of any knowledge economy. Assessment is the basis on which those skills are determined, and then accreditation kind of based on the validity of this assessment. So just kind of clarifying that link. Now the actors, again, when we look at this from an ecosystem perspective, you have students that are producing work, you have teachers that are assessing work, you have institutions that are accrediting work, and then you have employers in society that are, for lack of a better word, purchasing or using that work. The key issues and challenges that I think all assessment systems confront, but we want to, I think, talk a little bit about in the panel is quality. How do we know that students are doing quality work, which is the fundamental piece of a skills economy. Trust. How do we know that that work has been assessed correctly? Bias. How can we ensure that there's equity in the system? Collusion. How can we ensure that there's diversity in the system? And then transparency. How can we ensure that the rules established for assessment are clear, transparent, and unbiased? And this is kind of this idea that Wes mentioned of smart contracts. This is just basically kind of an if-then statement that if a student does X, then they will be rewarded with Y. So kind of thinking about kind of those incentive systems and ways in which the inherent functions of a blockchain in terms of exchange of value can be used to create more trust in the system is something that we want to explore a little bit today. So again, what we've spent a lot of our time on during kind of the first sessions of this series has been just looking at the use case of how do we know whether a student who has a degree from X university actually went to that university or actually took those courses? How do we verify trust at the degree diploma level? And again, that depends on the quality coming from the institution itself, providing the degree or diploma, and then ensuring that the student actually kind of did the work and graduated from the institution. More and more we're looking at, and I think the panel will touch on this, are challenges around 21st century skills, issues around kind of how we define them, how we measure them, how we operationalize them in a curriculum, and how we assess them. And I think the panel will touch on this a little bit. But what we've kind of found is that there are opportunities to kind of move away from self-assessment in 21st century skills to use technology to have a more holistic evaluation of the student, including expert assessment, peer assessment, computer measures. And again, moving towards the idea of task-based assessment so that the students are being assessed on authentic tasks that they can do, present in a system, and receive the validation and review and assessment within the system itself, which is the interconnection with technology and technology systems. So again, to get to the point of what Wes was talking about the challenges that we face with many students who are not in higher education programs, who are out of school, who have prior knowledge, how do we think about this idea of micro-credentials and whether assessment can actually be done at the course level or even at the task level, as opposed to the institutional level? That's one of the questions I want to kind of seed and pose to our panel as we move to the next session. So again, in terms of blockchain technology, looking at the issues of transparency and quality, talking about incentives. What are the types of incentives that can be put in place to assure honest assessment and honest completion of work by the students? What are the rules that can be developed in a transparent way? And again, as we move more and more towards online adaptive learning systems, this idea of having kind of transparent and clear rules, as well as the data on which those rules are based, becomes more and more important in order to trust that the assessment is actually happening. And again, trying to kind of unpack the black box often of kind of what are the algorithms, what are the rules, what is the data to determine whether somebody is a collaborative problem solver is difficult. And can the blockchain kind of open up that black box to make these rules more transparent? Community, how can community be more engaged in the assessment process? Again, around this issue of bias. If I'm in the class with Anthony, I might have a bias against him, but if Chris comes in and assesses Anthony's work, he will come with a different perspective. And then finally, what Wes mentioned is, can we look towards how we can create kind of an open global public good, a set of rules that are open, interoperable across platforms, and that different countries, different users, different course designers can use in their work. So let me just, the final 3 points, I just want to kind of, as Wes said, there aren't a lot of examples in the education space. So I wanted to kind of take some examples from the broader kind of crypto landscape and see how they might apply to assessment in education. So the first one is this idea of staking, that me, Bob Hawkins, if I do an assignment and I think it's really good, I might have some points that I want to stake on the validity of that assignment. So if I think it's really good, maybe I'll put 10 points on it. If I think it's so-so, I'll put 5 points on it. So it's a form of kind of self-assessment for the student. But if the community or the assessors, the teachers, determine that indeed that wasn't great work, I could potentially lose those points. So again, if I put 10 points on a very poor piece of work, I would lose those points. So these are the kind of game theory issues that we want to kind of get at, that are the heart of many crypto projects to facilitate trust across the system, that we want to see how we might be able to apply to assessment. On the same token, teachers, if I'm to kind of assess somebody, if I look at Anthony's work and I just say, I'm going to get through as many as I can, I'm going to give Anthony a 10, Chris a 10, Wes a 10, but indeed the community says, no, Anthony was actually a 5, then again, I might lose some of those points that I've staked on Anthony's work. So that's one idea. The other is this idea of what's called token curated registries, which is just a fancy word for a list or a ranking of quality. And this is done all the time. I mean, Facebook ranks what you see, Yelp ranks the best restaurants. And this is a way to kind of take that idea of ranking and decentralize it amongst the users themselves. So kind of looking at kind of what is a curated list: top students, GPA, honor roll, top grades, and it's a form of kind of rank order assessment. So I say, of this work that's done, Anthony was number 1, Chris was number 2, Wes was number 3. Somebody might come up with another rank. And you can apply some of these staking principles to this as well to kind of ensure honesty. And then the final point I wanted to raise is this idea of reputation, that based on your engagement in a system, you will acquire a reputation for being honest or maybe dishonest. And that reputation should carry on throughout your engagement in other either assessments or the work that you do as a student. And this would also kind of allow for kind of growth within the network of the system, that if you are a trusted validator, maybe your assessment weighs more than somebody who's less trusted. So again, kind of looking at these mechanics of reputation in the system. So let me stop there, again, leaving you with this final thought before moving to the panel. Can we look at kind of this rule set as kind of an open, interoperable set of smart contracts for assessment that is open to everyone? This is kind of what we want to kind of look at as a potential research case for this group going forward on this specific theme. So let me stop there. I'm excited to get to our panel. Let me just let them all introduce themselves, and then we'll kind of kick off, I think, with an initial question. So maybe Lydia, John, and Emiliana, just a quick introduction of who you are. And then Lydia, we'll come back to you and kind of ask you to kind of share a little bit about the work that ETS is doing around skills, measurement, and kind of what are the things that you're finding either most challenging or kind of most fascinating and interesting in your work. Let's just do a quick introduction, and then we'll come back to you, Lydia.
Thanks, Bob. I'm Lydia Liu. I'm very happy to be here. I am a principal research director at ETS. There are 3 research centers in my portfolio spanning K-12, higher ed, workforce, and global language teaching, learning, and assessment. I've been at ETS for about 15 years, and most of my research has been in the assessment and research of 21st century skills in both workforce and higher ed settings. Thanks.
Thanks, Lydia. John, over to you.
Thanks so much, Bob. And hi, everybody. My name's John Goodwin. I have been involved in the Lego ecosystem for just over 9 years. First 4.5, roughly, I worked within the consumer goods area, the fabulous bricks that you're all very familiar with. And then in the last 4.5 years, I've been the CEO of the Lego Foundation that is focused on supporting activities and research around the world to help children become creative, engaged, lifelong learners. At the moment, I've just finished my handoff as the CEO of the Lego Foundation, and I'm doing some work still in the Lego ecosystem, helping them explore new avenues for Lego learning in the future, hence my participation today.
Thanks, John. And over to you, Emiliana.
Thank you, Bob. So I'm Emiliana Vegas. I am Senior Fellow and Co-Director at the Center for Universal Education at Brookings. And it's very nice to see you, John, and others. Prior to joining Brookings, I worked at the World Bank for 11 years, and I headed the education division at the Inter-American Development Bank. So I'm coming to this a little bit with a little bit of intimidation from hearing from all of you very techie experts. I'm more of an education economist, trying to understand what's the potential of blockchain and digital technology to help improve pathways for individuals across the world to better gain the skills they need to succeed and get better jobs. So thank you.
Thanks, Emiliana. And the focus here is to focus on the educational aspects, and then we'll kind of weave in what might be some technical solutions. But again, the focus is on educational solutions. So with that in mind, Lydia, let me pass to you to kind of share the work that you're doing at ETS, kind of what you see as the major challenges in assessment and opportunities for kind of broadly use of technology. And if you want to talk about blockchain, great. And in the meantime, please use the chat to throw in any questions that you have. And again, we'll kind of intersperse questions and introduce you if you want to join the discussion. Lydia, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Bob. So my sharing today will mainly be about the work we do at ETS in assessing 21st century skills, particularly around some of the challenges we face and the approach we take to address them. A very relevant context is how to provide validation for students and learners to demonstrate their skills, and how to leverage technology in the assessment design, psychometrics, and score reporting. It's great that I speak after Wes and Bob, because you guys set up a very nice stage and background for the topics that I'm going to touch on today. So ETS has been doing a lot of research around 21st century skills, and a great milestone was that we established a center called the Center for New Constructs around 2000 for researchers to look at the definitions of 21st century skills, what kind of assessment formats that can be used that would go beyond self-assessment. And also the innovative psychometric models and score reporting. Evolving to this day, the research has expanded throughout K-12, higher ed, workforce, and language teaching, learning, and assessment contexts. Part of the reason we spent so much effort on looking at 21st century skills is really because it's workforce connection. Wes pointed to this earlier in his talk. There was a report released by McKinsey Global Institute this year, which talks about up to like 25% of the global workforce will have to switch their occupational categories by 2030. A lot of the physical, low cognitive, and repetitive tasks are going to be replaced by machines. And it's really the tasks that involve human judgment, creativity, and interaction are less likely to be replaced. And in addition to the workforce connection, another reason we want to look into the research around 21st century skills is really for a more responsible and informed citizenry. I think many of us here would agree that there is a need for us to combat bigotry, bias, prejudice, and all kinds of phobia, you name it. So it's really important we start looking young and early with our 21st century assessment and education. So our next generation are open-minded and are able to work with people from different cultural and economic backgrounds. So these different applications really raise the question of the context and the format of the assessment. We want the context to reflect a real world scenario. And we also need to make sure that it goes beyond the self-report. I mean, self-report does have advantages, but it also has major limitations. For example, how do we get around faking in responses, especially when the consequence of the assessment are high for the test takers? Do we really expect a test taker to say that I lie sometimes, I'm late to meetings, I sometimes fight with my colleagues? So there must be other ways that we can elicit more honest information to have a more accurate estimate of people's 21st century skills. So a lot of the constraints require the assessment formats that can help measure skills in an authentic way, help reduce faking responses, and at the same time can be scored by machines for efficiency. If we ask people to write an essay, maybe we can get deep information out of it, but the scoring is always a challenge. The score rubrics and the training of the readers to make sure there is consistency across readers, and also how we control the subjectivity in ratings. So all those are issues to be considered. One example I wanted to share here is a pilot study we're currently undertaking called the Personal Skills and Qualities PSQ assessment. It is an interpersonal and interpersonal skills assessment. And these skills are expected to be essential to both higher ed and workforce success, such as perseverance, leadership, and creativity. It uses an item format called forced choice that helps reduce faking in responses. So we're currently working with graduate programs and business and law schools to see how PSQ can be used for holistic admissions and student development. Another thing that was, I think, Bob, it was you who talked about it, it's the validation of the assessment and credentials. We always want to look for validity evidence to support the claims of the assessment. In a school setting, for example, we may be able to look at the correlations between the social and the emotional skills. and academic standing and students' classroom behavior. In a workforce setting, a lot of the employers say that they want to know people with higher 21st century scores actually have better performance. But it's the tricky part is around the definition. When you listen to them unpacking those concepts, for example, critical thinking, there is a lot of variation in terms of what they mean by critical thinking. So it's very important we have a very transparent and clear definition from the get-go. And so these are the cases that we should have in mind way before writing the first assessment questions. We need to think about the definition. We need to think about the claims. We need to have a validation plan in place in order to find out whether our claims about people's 21st century skills can be supported with evidence. And also a question relevant to today's discussion is how they bank their credentials and take those with them as they move from institution to institution or to the job market. So most assessment activities have limited testing time for the tasks. Like at most, we can ask people to sit in a 3 or 4 hour test. And most of the assessment activities have a limited budget and a limited score reporting window that call for a solution that's both scientifically sound and practical. So at ETS, we rely on the evidence-centered design in our approach to assessment. We start the process by thinking of the users and the score report. So what information does the score user want to have on the score report? And essentially, what claims can we make about the test taker that's useful for the score user? Then think about what tasks we could design to elicit such information or evidence. So in our own research, we really start by defining the skills, like what core dimensions it has, how it relates to similar concepts, but also what the differences are. And then when we design and validate the assessment, we consider a host of issues to ensure the fairness, equity, and validity of the assessment. We consider the complexity of the questions and also the nature of the underlying dimension we want to get at. For example, we don't want a lot of reading in a math test, so it becomes a reading test. We also want to consider the language to be free of bias, and then all the accessibility issues for students with disabilities. And most recently, we've started a lot of research looking at how students' diverse backgrounds can be factored in our assessments to make sure that the assessments are socially and culturally responsive.
Lydia, I want to come back to you on a few of these points. I mean, one kind of was raised by Tom around kind of the idea of the actual tasks and how to make them kind of real world. And the other was kind of Rupert and kind of the aggregation of evidence and banking credentials. So let's come back to you on some of those points. I want to move on to John to kind of just share a little bit of the work that the Lego is doing. And then we'll kind of come back on some of these points for specific questions to you, Lydia, after Emiliana gives a bit of an overview.
Sounds great.
John, over to you.
Okay, Bob, thanks. Yeah, so at the Lego Foundation, we really started with some key challenges that have emerged from research. One is, and we're focused on specifically 0 to 11-year-old children at this point in time. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So the first one is that for children from birth up to high school, 80% of more than 80% of their waking hours are spent outside of school. However, in many cultures and environments around the world, there's a focal point around the fact that the child will only learn and develop in a school environment. But there's a huge opportunity for children to develop outside. However, there's no way to capture that development. So we were challenging ourselves as to how to do that. The next data point is the one that's already been referenced by Lydia with regards to the need for adults in the future to be constantly reskilled. So on that basis, what we wanted to do is to ensure that at the early formational stages of a child's life, they really had that passion for learning and a desire to continue to learn through their life. And as we know from a lot of the research that's been conducted, that is certainly not the case in most environments where a significant minority of children are very disengaged in the classroom context. So really to nurture that ability to be a lifelong learner, to facilitate future reskilling. And then the third piece is the research that really indicates that children that are recognized and acknowledged for their progress versus their outputs become much more resilient on their learning journey. But so often, children are only assessed on the basis of output. And a lot of the recognition that they get or the praise that they receive is on the basis of a score that they've attained, as opposed to what they did in achieving that result. So really finding a way in which we can recognize and appreciate the process. And then the fourth dilemma was really getting to the point that was raised by Jacob or Jacob in the chat with regards to assessing 21st century skills, or as we call them, foundational skills in the LEGO Foundation. And whilst for sure it is difficult, the irony that we found is that when you enter the workplace, your skills are assessed consistently by your employer. And I think it's almost never is that employee assessed on the basis of sitting down and doing a test and regurgitating how much knowledge they've accumulated, but rather it's through observational approaches and feedback. So given those four challenges, we then set about to try and think through whether there's a technological approach to help us with this. And this is where we got together with an amazing community, a group, the guys at We Library and folks at We Library and the Learning Economy, some folks from BrainPop, specifically Yigal Rosen, who's been working with OECD on their whole creativity assessment, and then both with the LEGO Group and the LEGO Foundation to see whether we can develop an app which really incentivizes children to undertake tasks where they are rewarded through badging processes or tokens, and we're really getting recognition of the task that they've undertaken, the approach that they've done, and getting that recognition with the desire to see whether or not we can get either peer-based recognition and acknowledgement of the undertaking and completion of the task, or community-based. So it could be other adults, not necessarily child-based peers. So that's the process that we've been adopting. What we are curating is a bunch of activities that we have developed through the research within the LEGO Foundation that we know has good causal linkage with the development of certain foundational skills, such that if the child's undertaking them, what we can then get is a degree of confidence that they're progressing along their journey of their social skills or their emotional skills, creativity, critical thinking as examples. And then what we're trying to do through the app is find different ways in which we can recognize and acknowledge that. So we'll be testing things like video uploads. We'd also be testing peer inputs and things like that in order to get different ways of accreditation that's outside formal institutions. So that's a quick fly-in on what we're doing on the Super Skills Lab. And what we believe is the technology on blockchain is a great way in which we can get that recognition. Now, admittedly, for 0 to 11-year-olds, this is not necessarily going to qualify them to go off and do brain surgery, but it is a great way in which we can guide them along their journey and their path of skills development and nudge them into certain areas depending on where they are on their journey. Because so much of formal education systems are based on age related items. You're in a certain age, therefore you will undertake these certain tasks, and therefore you will be assessed on this sort of knowledge. And what we're trying to get is a lot more flexibility for each child depending on where they are and how they're evolving at any one point in time and where their interests are. Remember, one of the things we're trying to solve for is really getting a passion for learning and for recognizing the process. And we believe this is a great way of doing that, and stepping out of the formalized age-based structures that exist in current education systems. But let me just stop there, Bob, and then pass it
Thanks,
back
John.
to...
Lots of interesting nuggets there. I mean, one that I want to kind of follow up on at some point is this idea of a task library that is linked to specific skills. This would be kind of an incredible global public good that could be contextualized for any one of a number of countries or educational institutions that want to kind of know whether going out and interviewing somebody in the community really does develop empathy, for instance. The other point that I want to dig a little bit further, I think, when we get to questions, is both the idea, and Jakob, I'm going to come to you as well as to Rupert on kind of the accumulation of skills and kind of the ideas of progress and how we think about that. And then also, John, just to give some thought to kind of what does engagement mean? What is the link to curriculum? You know, from Lego, how do you incorporate play? How do you incorporate storytelling into some of this curriculum, into the tasks themselves, which is another area of interest that we're engaged in that I can share a little bit more about as well. But before we go to the questions, let me now go to Emiliana to share a little bit of her work and thinking at Brookings. And then we'll kind of open it up and bring some others into the discussion. Emiliana?
Thank you, Bob. And yeah, thanks for having me. Well, as you may know, Brookings at the Center for Universal Education, we've been really trying to work with the idea of how to leapfrog in education, particularly help low and middle income countries that have been basically stagnant in their learning outcomes for their students while they have been increasing enrollment. But the gains in learning are have been falling behind steadily, and COVID has only increased that gap. And so as part of that work, we started thinking about what are innovative ways in which we can think about engaging students differently, engaging with education systems differently. I was lucky enough to meet Chris Purifoy right before COVID in Doha, and we were talking about the work that Learning Economy Foundation was doing, and it just sparked my interest because coming from the IDB, where we had been learning a lot about blockchain and trying to explore its applications for education and training, trying to see, well, how can we make sure that these efforts don't stay in the developed world and really help include those children and youth who are in low and middle income countries who are staying out of kind of the high quality jobs and opportunities that others have around the world. So that's kind of the backdrop for this work. And so our work has sort of, I would say, 3 goals. One is to take stock of the efforts that are taking place internationally in using digital technologies to provide learning and employment records. And so really kind of just understand what's happening, take a stock taking, but then develop a framework that would allow us to better understand and classify them for people like me who are not from the technology industry, who are not used to really talking about, let's say, all the interoperability and other languages that you guys use, but really decision makers who are maybe don't have a lot of time. How can they better understand what's happening, and also how could it benefit the most marginalized students in their countries? So that's kind of the third role, is really coming up with some policy recommendations that would inform I guess, the regulatory frameworks to make this a more inclusive, let's say, experience, a more inclusive process, so that those who are the least likely, let's say, to get the skills they need are the more likely, once these technologies are available, to have those opportunities. So that's in a very short nutshell what we're embarking to do. We are seeing this as a multi-phase process, where in the first phase, we would do sort of this kind of bigger picture landscape typology and sort of initial recommendations. And then as more data is out on actually who is using and how they're using and who's benefiting from digital technologies for skills acquisition and for demonstration of what they learn for then the job market, as well as later educational opportunities, that we can also take actually a more analytical view or empirical view at what's happening on the ground in different places. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Emiliana. There are a few kind of interesting questions that I referred to that I want to kind of bring into the discussion, and maybe these individuals can also kind of point their questions to one of our panelists as well, if they want to go deeper. But I think the first one was Jacob. I'll let you introduce yourself. And this is an important issue that I kind of raised before, kind of as more and more assessment is integrated into adaptive learning type systems. Many times this data and the algorithms or the rule sets get kind of hidden in a black box, and we kind of take on faith what is provided by the application developer, that indeed their application develops creative problem solving, for instance, but they're not willing to kind of give up their IP. So there is kind of a business case here. Now the question is, and actually the game aspect of these devices aren't necessarily they're in for engagement, but they're in for engagement to collect data. All of the gaming is really focused on getting as much data as possible to feed the algorithms. So again, I wanted to kind of ask Jacob to jump in here, or Jakob, to kind of share his question, and then also to maybe reflect a little bit on what might be the role of a more open, transparent system to kind of open this black box. But Jacob, over to you, and you can direct your question to whomever you want.
Yeah, so my question is really how we can facilitate a testing which is much more natural than the ones that we have with in the sort of text-based creativity measures that we have now. How we can ensure that we develop metrics that are broad enough to capture those complex nuanced skills that creativity and the other 21st century skills or foundational skills are. So what we're seeing is that we're sort of seeing a bifurcation of some people who say that we have some game or some interaction that fosters that, but we're not seeing that much, let's say, research support around that. We've just recently done, as part of Janet's PhD studies, a fairly thorough review of games fostering creativity or not fostering, but assessing creativity. And there are a lot of benefits to the approach, but there's also a lot of challenges. So how can we foster an ecosystem across this whole value chain in which we really become research-based as much as possible, and not just jump to it seems like this kind of interaction is really fostering or assessing these skills, where we know that these skills are very important. And so I think that really requires an effort across the line. That's where the open approach really comes in, and not locking ourselves into under proprietary laws. And
Where's the question?
So I don't know whether Emiliana, John, Lydia, any of you want to kind of take a stab at kind of any reflection or thoughts on Jacob's issue around being a little bit more evidence research driven in this process?
I'm happy to kick off, and then
Awesome.
Let my co-panelists jump in. And specifically looking at creativity, and there's many people on this call, Rupert for one, that's much better qualified than I am in order to speak to the sort of meta versus micro analysis of these breadth of skills. But creativity, for example, we've done research, and obviously the definition of creativity varies across cultures, but also in the context of the difference between divergent and convergent creativity, which are very different schools and utilizing different parts of the brain. So it's unlikely that we're going to get to a state, I believe, where you have a single numerical metric that defines where somebody is in the creativity ledger. But what I believe that we had through the opportunity of a blockchain is the ability to be able to determine, as I mentioned before, an individual's journey, a growth of competence with regards to the utilization of creativity. And the nature of the blockchain allows us to get into the nuance of the specific applications of creativity that individual is particularly strong at. And that is really powerful, as I think we heard in some of our earlier sessions, around the linkage into specific employment contexts, where we build up over time the more granular nature of the types of creativity that an individual is able to display, and then linking that to that specific employment opportunity that really draws upon that competence. So I really feel that we need to break the paradigm of the sort of scores-based assessment process that we're all so familiar with in the context of education systems, and migrate more to a continuum of displayed competence, which I believe the technology of distributed ledger, it really does provide a fantastic solution to recognize that and enable us to sever that historical linkage with the numerical knowledge-based determination.
Thanks, John. Before going to Lydia and Emiliana, I wanted to bring Rupert into this discussion, since he asked a question around this very issue of, I guess it's moving from summative to formative to, I don't know what we call it, progressive, and how do we kind of capture this journey, and how do we account also for failure, which is kind of an important part of the journey and growth. And is this possible? So Rupert, maybe if you want to kind of frame your question, maybe kind of respond to John as well. Over to you, Rupert.
Yeah, sure. So I like using analogies. I always use them. So let me bring one in. So imagine we're all carrying our learning wallet around with us, okay? And then in that learning wallet, we have our notes and our coins, our learning notes and our learning coins from what we've accrued, right? So if we're going to move to that accrued evidence model, we still need to check some of the notes. We need to check that they're viable for trading. Okay, so coming back to John's point there about moving to a more progressive model, we'll still need assessment centers, we'll still need formal education, we'll still need ways of being able to do that, and we'll need to avoid fraud. So we'll need to avoid people just be able to put monopoly money in their learning wallet and then just use that. Okay, but I think the point I was trying to get to the question was, Bitcoin provides you a way to verify the individual coins, right? So you can say, okay, each one of these can be trusted. But actually, the issue is more a cultural trust issue and a shift towards accrued evidence as the model that we can trust in. It's much more about that, I would say, than the technological solution of using a particular technology to achieve this, okay? So I'm just asking the question, how much is it we need to have a particular technology to verify all of this? And how much actually is it we need to shift more on the cultural side of it?
Thanks, Rupert. Lydia or Emiliana, do you want to jump in with either of these? Lydia.
Sure. I want to add on a little bit on the providing evidence to support the claims we want to make about individuals. When we approach assessment work, we really start thinking about the claims we want to make about them. And one of the challenges is, even if we have a very thorough understanding or framework of what creativity is, what critical thinking is, how to turn that into specific tasks that can help us elicit that information really involves a lot of work. We have to think about the content representation, the scoring requirement, what technology platform we're going to use, when we administer that kind of assessment and the accessibility issues. So I just wanted to point to our attention that when we think of the whole end-to-end assessment design, having the framework is like the first step. And then there are a lot of technological, and scoring issues that we need to consider. And I think in one of the earlier chats, Ed from California mentioned a great point about the cultural difference. A lot of the assessments, if you move from one context to another, we will have to reestablish its validity. The other thing I want to mention quickly is there are tools that would allow us to look deeper into the diagnostic function of assessment. A lot of the assessments are digital. We can look at the process data to see how test takers interact with the tasks and think about how to provide immediate and instant feedback. A lot of the tasks can be scored by machine, which even if they're open-ended, which would allow us to give that feedback and help transition from a summative to a more formative assessment scenario.
Thanks, Lydia. Just one quick follow-up. Are there any specific domains or competencies that you find have been easier to define and to measure? So for instance, is communication easier than creativity? And are there certain skills that lend themselves more to this computer or machine measurement as opposed to the human measurement that you've been working on at ETS?
Right, yeah, if just speaking out of my own experience, a lot of the cognitive assessments, it's more straightforward to define them and put them into tasks and scenarios. A lot of the 21st century skills like creativity, critical thinking, they're such a multi-dimensional and culturally loaded, and it's challenging to assign a clear definition and also come up with tasks that would meet all the technical and the cultural requirements. So I would say that the cognitive tasks are more straightforward to design.
Yeah. Thanks. I know Brookings, Emiliana, you guys just did a seminar on this morning. I don't know if you want to kind of share a little bit from that or respond to any of the other questions. Over to you, Emiliana.
I'm happy to put the link on the seminar this morning on the chat, where exactly this was sort of the focus, is how should we be assessing the breadth of skills, particularly after COVID. But frankly, like, I'm learning a lot here listening to all of you. The assessment in particular is not my field of expertise, so I'm thinking about a lot of how do we actually assess competencies that are universal, and how can the community kind of come together and say, hey, let's agree on these competencies that we want all, let's say, young people entering the labor market to have, and sort of and I liked a lot what John was saying about decouple the assessment from the age and allow people to kind of demonstrate their mastery of these skills when they achieve them, and not necessarily a certain grade level. So I think we have a lot of thinking to do around how can this be also a tool to help really transform education systems and how they group students and how they personalize education.
Awesome, thanks, Emiliana. I know my colleague Diego has kind of put some questions into the chat. I don't know if Diego, you want to jump into the conversation. We also, Anthony, I'd like to kind of get your sense from the Caribbean of kind of from a policy perspective, how you're kind of digesting this conversation and kind of opportunities for the islands in the Caribbean. And then I think Kelly just posted something. We might come to you as well, Kelly. But Diego, over to you. Diego, you're on mute if you wanted to jump in. Maybe Diego's having problems. Anthony, did you want to jump into the conversation just to kind of share some perspectives from the Caribbean? Okay, we'll go to Michael. Michael, did you want to kind of share your question? Michael Torrance. And then we'll go to Kelly.
Hey, Bob.
Hi,
Everybody.
Michael.
I was just thinking about this integration of the place in the space as we talked about the cultural context. I'm always really focused on equity and belongingness, more so belongingness than just equity, diversity, inclusion. But when we talk about creating an assessment tool that's going to afford for these skills based on, I think we've been calling it hyperlocal or global. Jakub, your question for me lends itself to how do you lean into where you are, where I am, where everyone is, in assessing that competency or that skill based on beyond markings. And that's why I interjected that failure is a very, very important component of this that needs to be embraced more so than we have usually done that, where we say, that's bad, you failed, you're done. But in the gaming experience, failure is a good thing because you get to retry until success. And I don't know if that's a question, Bob, is more of a statement. And if anyone wants to add any or dig into that, they can, I suppose.
Thanks, Michael. Let me bring Kelly into this, and then we'll do another round with our panelists. Kelly, you had a very long thread on how do we assure validity and non-bias in the development of these instruments. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah. So
clarify.
firstly, I do just want to say thank you. I think it's a wonderful discussion and really interesting to see the different perspectives that are emerging in this space. And it's a really important discussion. So thank you, Chris, Colin, and Taylor for the invitation. I think my question, and the years I've been involved in learning, often we question the results of standardized tests, tools, metrics, yet we don't often question the design of them. And so that's really my question in some of the studies that I've done that have looked at how we measure, whether it be multiple choice tests, whether it be, all sorts of different types of options, there is bias and error in that. And often what we think they're measuring is not actually what they're measuring, or what the learner is reading and responding to is not what we intended as the designer. So it's a really interesting part of, especially for the blockchain, because as I'm learning more and more about blockchain, you're going to respond to certain tools and metrics, and it could potentially be permanently on your record for life. So it's really questioning the design of the different tools and metrics and cross-cultural equivalence. There's two bodies of thought, cross-country and cross-cultural equivalence. And I lean towards cross-cultural because, firstly, a lot of the metrics and tools that we use in learning are very biased towards certain education systems, certain rules or schools of thought around learning, from North America, from England, and so forth. Like when we applied in Australia some of the metrics and tests that came out of Great Britain, it didn't actually apply in the same way. And even though we're both English-speaking countries, that's not about that. So countries are highly culturally diverse. And we have to do a number of studies on the tools to ensure that how they're being read and interpreted in the culture of interest of the learner is really important. So I just sort of raise, we often throw up test scores and differentiation between learners. And I'm like, no, question the test first before we question the teachers, the assessor, or the learner. Because it's a science. Psychometric testing is most definitely a science, but it's super interesting what you're doing here. And I'm like, okay, how are we uncovering the bias and the validity issues in the tests and tools themselves? I often, look at evaluation of learning as well. To me, assessment is a tool, whereas evaluation is the process and the experience. And I look for input from learners, from teachers, from peers, as well as the student body. So it's super interesting. How do you also get like a triangle view of evaluation? So you get multiple lenses on that evaluation. So that was really just my curious, and I know it's a long question.
No, I think Kelly, this gets to the heart of, I think, a lot of the discussions we've been having around kind of how do you think about standards and standardization of ability to kind of measure across schools, across regions, across countries, and yet at the same time be able to account for these local cultural aspects that maybe are just germane to that local community, where they really want to kind of measure this aspect, and this is important not just for the school, the student, but for the employer as well. So these are important things, and I think there's a interesting piece here. I mean, again, kind of getting back to the blockchain piece of the ability to decentralize, the ability to kind of empower local communities, and yet at the same time be part of kind of a global community. I think there's something there. Smarter people on this call will probably have some ideas, but there might be some aspect to this to be able to empower local communities in the determination of kind of what they value in terms of skills and how they measure them.
Yeah, of course.
Let me go to, I know Diego's fixed his mic. He's a colleague of mine that might want to respond to some of these questions, ask his own questions, and then we'll do kind of another round with our group. And I know Philip has also put a question in here, so I might come to you, Philip, as well. Over to you, Diego.
Thank you, Bob. And for some reason, every time I have a meeting with you is when my mic decides to not work correctly, but there's something here. Thank you, everybody. My name is Diego Luna Basalua. I am a psychometrician working at the World Bank. And sorry, maybe because I haven't been involved in these conversations, but I'm not totally following some of the ideas and discussions here discussed. Is the intention of this blockchain activity or ideas to emulate something similar to home delivery assessments with proctoring? Because if that is the case, there are already initiatives out there and best practices and standards in the educational measurement community that could be followed, but not reinventing the wheel. Or is this blockchain process to obtain an accreditation something different than assessing remotely? Maybe it's too fundamental and I'm not following this as I should, but to me, there's already a lot of in-depth experience on online examinations and remote examinations, such as GRE at home and TOEFL at home. I'm not sure what is the linkage with blockchain.
Thanks, Diego. I have some thoughts and I'll share, but let me see. I don't know, John, do you want to jump in on this one? Does anybody else? Rupert, Chris, and then I'll give my perspective as well. John?
Yeah, sure. As I tried to lay out earlier, one of the things that we're trying to solve for is having or capturing learning experiences in a multiplicity of environments. So not just in staged assessment situations, but also finding a way in which to capture processes that the learner has undertaken that can be recognized through others in their proximity. And then obviously the quality of that assessment goes through the different stages that Bob was talking about with regards to the staking and the reputation, and these are things to be explored. So again, this is not a technology where we're looking to apply to because we've got the technology, let's apply it to a problem. It's the problem that we are recognizing and then trying to find the technology to solve the joint challenge of learning in every environment, recognition of the process versus a separate independent event where a child or a learner is assessed or appraised, but more assessing them on the basis of the continuum, and then finding a mechanism that will make that interoperable. So when you add those criteria together, that's where we believe the blockchain can be a part of this solution in the problem.
Thanks, John. Bina, I know you just posted in the chat. Do you want to build off of that at all before? I also like Rupert kind of presented at our last seminar on the skills economy, and maybe Rupert, you might have some thoughts as well. But Bina, to you.
Yeah, I would say the blockchain is not simulating anything, Diego. It is simply like a silent observer memorializing or recording what's going on. And it provides accessibility for you, me, everywhere to record according to certain rules and policies, and also quantifying something many of us are talking about, the hyperintelligence and the things that we cannot quantify with the regular text question and answering. If we can do that, and it puts them together on the blockchain. Diego enters something, Jacob enters something, and then at some point we can write an application that can take all these things for anybody, for anybody to look at. And since it is immutable, it's a trusted, as long as we provide only trusted people to enter the information, it provides a trusted platform for you and me to view what's going on, and then quantify that into a degree or a certificate or a course credit or something like that. So it's just an instrument. It's just an instrument like an internet, I would say. So it is not the product. It's just an instrument that is behind the scene, monitoring what's going on, and not like in a Snoopy way. It is created by you, me, authorized persons that are there, teachers. And of course, they are all doing it with certain policies, not like whimsical, like, any other social media, throw something in there. And then, later on can be used for quantifying it into a certificate or something else. I think long way to go, but I think it provides that platform for all of us.
Thanks, Bina. Very useful. Rupert, do you want to build off of our last discussion at all on this issue? Rupert.
Yeah, I'll just, so I'm, an analogy king, so I'm going to go with another analogy here, which might be useful, Diego, particularly in terms of what you're talking about there. So I talk a lot in my writings about learning fitness, okay, about developing your learning fitness, right, in the same way that you do with physical fitness. And so what we're talking about here is, what are the performance measures? What are the metrics that we would use to measure learning fitness, to show that you're able to do a task in various different ways, right? Okay, so part of the discussion of that is, how do you verify the performance? So for example, if you could pretend you've gone on the treadmill and ran a great time. So how do we check against that, right? But also, what are the things that we need to measure, and why do we need to measure them? Okay, so if we're trying to move to, we're effectively trying to move from a situation where the only way you would assess learning fitness is you go along to somewhere where they make you work out and they witness you doing it in person and say, yeah, this person's fit, to a situation where you can get fit at home or wherever the environment, in and out of a formal context, and that can be verified. Okay, so that's where we're trying to get to. And it's like, what are the things that enable us to do that?
Thanks very much, Rupert. Yeah, I wanted to bring Jim, if you're willing to jump into the conversation, and then maybe Matthew as well. And then I know we've kind of melded from panel into community discussion. So again, if you want to participate, either raise your hand or kind of throw a question into the chat. But I think a few things, Diego, that have been raised is kind of one, this issue of openness, of being able to have a transparent view of kind of what data is being collected, and kind of what is the rule set on which assessments are being done. This idea that, again, these rules are auditable, and that they're kind of open and you can review them and question them and interrogate them. The idea of decentralization, I do think there is this idea of kind of empowering local communities around kind of identifying what might be their own use of what could be kind of a global public good, of a set of tasks and a set of measures that they can then kind of contextualize for their own processes. I think that kind of this extendability, as Bina was saying, that all this data is open. So new applications being built on this open data, I think, is a huge opportunity. And then finally, I think the premise that we started at the beginning is that much of the accreditation is done based on the trust of the institution. Is there a way to kind of lower this down to the actual course level, so that you can give micro credentials, or even to the task level? So that's kind of a big question. But I don't know, Jim, do you want to jump into the fray?
Sure. My point was just that.
And maybe Jim, just introduce yourself as well.
Hi, I'm Jim Goodell with QIP. I'm also leading the T3 Innovation Network Data and Technology Standards Network. My point was just that outdated and stale data, if it's in an immutable blockchain, unless that's controlled with smart contracts, could be used against someone, and it may be making assertions that no longer apply to the person.
That is a great point. So this idea that we talked about of progressive evaluation, how do you take account of, maybe somebody had developed a number of failures that are now immutable on the blockchain, and how do you take into account of that in terms of their own growth and maybe kind of their adaptation as well? I think is a very interesting question. I think Vlad has Vlad, let me go to Matthew because he had a question in there and his mic's on, and then over to you, Vlad. Matthew.
No,
please introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, Matthew Hellstone, Brigham Young University, and participating with Learning Economy as well. And IEEE ILR group as well. So my comment was just to make sure that an aspect, right, that you have in verifiable credentials, that we also include the measurement, the rule, tool, or process inside of the verifiable credential, that being the base foundation of all the blockchain platforms that we have on there. And so embedding that measurement or assessment tool, that assessment and that rule can be tied to a meta registry, right, that can have reputation around it. So going back to my comment about reputation as well, right, we have assessments that can change over time, like you just alluded to, Bob. And so we can say, all right, that assessment was done in that time, but as advancing measurements kind of emerge, then the learner can also be informed, if it's in the credential, hey, you have more advanced tools and measurements that can help you go to your pathway, right? And so, but building on that reputation in the network, I don't think it's only an individual with their voting power. It can also be organizations, right? And I can have kind of a network of who endorsed me, who endorsed them, who endorses a particular organization or entity. And that natural kind of organic reputation of trust can be built. Obviously, that trust can also be damaged, but then it can regrow again, right, based on reputation of people that have trust established in different areas. So that, and I also wanted to kind of propose the idea of pathway sharing. If I have a pathway of my credentials, if I have the power to share that, it's in the form of a transcript, but it's almost like a customized way how I got to a certain place, and I can give guidance to others, where I can kind of share that with all of my assessment measurements along the way, whatever value they have in my pathway sharing capability. So I just wanted kind of to throw those out, that the verifiable credential is kind of this foundational technical concept. I think the blockchain platforms give a way to verify the data, that the data is valid and can be trusted, but only trusted based on the trust of the reputation of the issuer, and also the reputation of the measurement tool or process that can also be embedded inside of the verifiable credential.
So these are the types of questions that I was kind of alluding to before around kind of the rule set, the smart contracts that can be designed, and the possibilities are limitless, that could be designed as kind of open global public goods to kind of take into account kind of all of these variables that need to be considered in assessment. I'm going to go to, I know we're at 12:20, so I'm going to go to two more. Vlad wanted to jump in, and then Philip, and then I'm going to come back to all of our presenters, Wes, Lydia, John, Emiliana, and then Chris is going to close us out. But I wanted our presenters just to think about kind of the one issue that they would like this community to kind of follow up on or go deeper on, because we've opened a lot of questions, and I'd like to kind of hear from you guys. What is the one question that you as an individual or your institution is kind of most interested in digging deeper on and kind of creating a research agenda around this discussion? But before going there, let's go to Vlad. Over to you, Vlad.
Thank you. So yeah, I just want to respond to Jim Goodell's feedback that anything on the blockchain or anchored to the blockchain can be used against them. And that's certainly true. But I also think that any credible assertion on the blockchain should have an expiration date. We all have qualities and all have expiration date, whether we like it or not. And so that's important. Another thing that's important is, to an extent possible, we want to keep the personally identifiable information off of the blockchain. And other ways to manage it, as there are technical terms to do one-way hash, where you can just compress a document to a degree where it's not readable by anybody else. So the way, it's certainly true, but there are ways around this problem, and I know some of the ways that have been proven practically to work.
Thanks, Vlad. I don't know how to take that note. We all have an expiration date, but I agree that
in both literal ways and not literal.
Okay, Philip, over to you, and then we'll do our round with our presenters. Philip.
Sure, thanks. Phil Long, T3 Innovation Network, Learning Employment Record, and other things. The conversation is very rich, and there's multiple dimensions to this that I think are going to be worthwhile exploring at length. But two things. One is the comment that Vlad made about the expiration date is reflective in my concern about making sure that the individual retains some degree of responsibility for the way in which the data recorded about them is used and or applied. And one notion of that, the expiration is one method for doing that. Another, Rupert piped in to say that if we think about an upper layer of abstraction to the actual assertion about the data, that might give some distance between the actual data and the individual and what it's actually intending to represent. But I retain the concern that we all need to be able to reinvent ourselves. And so that suggests that the individual needs to be able to have some degree of not control necessarily, but influence and maybe in certain degrees control on certain items that reflect what data about them persists for how long, and in some sense force a reassessment at various times around some critical dimensions. And that leads to the last comment, which is that these multi-dimensional notions of axes of creativity and other things are things that are only emerging now as capabilities with things like DAG environments, which allow you to have descriptors in a semantic sense with n-tuples of variables that describe or pertain to a common assertion or a common element. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Phil. Absolutely. I mean, we reinvent ourselves, whether intentionally or unintentionally, just through forgetting what we've learned. My wife says that our marriage is fresh because she's forgotten so much of our past that it's like meeting me new every day. So I don't know if that's good or bad. Anyhow, let's do our round. And again, just kind of very short. We're at 5 minutes left. Kind of the one critical issue research agenda that you'd like to follow up on. Let me start with Wes. Wes?
Thanks, everyone. Well, it's so impressive. Learning can contribute to development. How we value and understand learning and link that to our broader development goals, both locally and globally. There's a lot more we can do in that space. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wes. Put that in the chat also. You were breaking up a little bit, but I think it's linking learning to development goals and kind of the benefit of society. I think if that's what you said. Lydia, over to you.
Mm-hmm. I think the one issue I'd like to emphasize is on the equity side. It's so important we have equity in mind throughout the design process rather than treat it as an afterthought. We also want to make sure we engage in assessment literacy for our stakeholders and interest groups to understand the science, the process, the limitations, and the uses of assessment.
Thanks, Lydia. John, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Bob, and thanks everybody for the really rich dialogue and the comments. I really hope we can capture all of the comments in the chat as well. Yeah, I am really interested in the whole validation process that's been discussed a number of times, and Bob set it up really nicely in finding ways of validating the credentials of an appraiser over time through the cross-validation of what they've input into an individual's learning journey in order to get that calibration for others.
Thanks, John. And then finally to you, Emiliana.
Thank you. I guess hearing all this very rich discussion, I think we are at an inflection point where there's a lot of thought and research going on in sort of the verified credentials, the LERs. And I think we need to also help translate and explain some of these advances to kind of the lay person so that it can be part of what normal education systems are doing, which I don't think they're aware or they're incorporating. And I really believe that this can be so transformative that it just we need to kind of bring others on board. That would be my message.
That is an awesome message, Emiliana, to end on, because I think that's part of our work, is translating technology to the application in education for our stakeholders. Chris, over to you for closing remarks.
Yeah, I first want to thank everyone. This was a really rich discussion, one of the better ones we've had. Where I want to point and double click, I think there were a couple of things. Number one, I loved what John said about the idea that learners who are encouraged along the way tend to have more resilience. Let's not forget that. I think a lot of times when it comes to assessment, we really, really focus on outcomes, and we forget that encouragement along the way is what actually creates our lifelong journey, right? And so how can we maybe assess encouragement along the way, right? Is this a new way of thinking about it? Maybe it's not just the outcomes, but how do we do it as they go so that we can, and part of that is gamification, which goes back to another thing that, Jacob, talked about, who has been one of our great advisors at Learning Economy Foundation. And, interestingly, they're also in Denmark. So, Lego and, what they're doing at the Institute is, and it's incredible in looking at how can we use cognitive understandings to assess. And I think the real learning there was, how do we know that it's a real assessment? I think this is really important too, right? It's easy to say, well, we said it was on the app, but was it, and why? Why do we know that this is creativity and they're actually earning these skills? So I think this is good. And I think it comes down to, which kind of leads to our next session, which I want to plug here, which is December 15th, which is incentivization is going to be really important, right? So how do we understand that assessment, which is an asset that we earn, right? I get assessed, I get a credential. In a sense, that's an asset, that's a currency that I'm earning. But how do we go further and start to incentivize the learning journey, incentivize the earning of skills, incentivizing the progress of peer review, incentivize teaching, right? I mean, how can we really invert a lot of this? And I think there's a lot to learn, there's a lot to do, but I want to thank our panelists and all those others who are doing really exciting work here. Onward to the next one. I hope you'll all join us.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Just to echo Chris's thanks. I mean, the discussion was fantastic because of all of you. Thanks for your contributions, both in the dialogue and in the chat. We'll capture the chat and share that back with everybody. And again, we will have our final session of the year in December, but we also want to think about kind of what might be a research agenda going forward into 2022. So thank you for our panelists for beginning to kind of put some ideas out there, and we'll continue this discussion next time. So thanks again for everybody, and we'll be in touch. Have an awesome day. Bye-bye.